Our second reading this morning is from Exodus 20, verses 1 through 17. Then God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and the fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. For 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. A few years ago, I decided that the time had come to begin holding regular family meetings in our house. The idea came to me from one of my favorite parenting experts, Christine Carter, who made the case that family meetings are a great way to strengthen relationships and help all the pieces of a family's life to run more smoothly. Carter had 3 recommendations for how to run a good family meeting. First, you should make that first meeting 100% positive. So you want everyone to leave the meeting wanting to come back for the next one. Second, you've got to make them fun. Carter recommended serving dessert and making sure that fun items for discussion outnumber negative items. Finally, keep the meetings consistent and predictable so that they eventually start to run themselves. It sounded like such a good idea. But during our first family meeting, I don't think anyone had finished their first cookie before things went south. One of the kids made a snarky comment about a sibling, and the bickering went from there. My husband kept glancing at his cell phone and reminding me that we needed to wrap things up in order to get the kids to bed on time. And it turns out that even if you're eating cookies while you do it, it just isn't fun to divvy up the family chores. Truth be told, family meetings at our house were an epic fail. We haven't had one since. Today, we get to listen in on the first family meeting of the Israelites, God's chosen people, as we consider this third story in our series, the story of the Sinai Covenant. First, God called Abraham to be the father of a great nation. Then, after Abraham's descendants were enslaved, God rescued them in a series of events called the Exodus. Once the Israelites were free, they had some work to do to figure out just what it meant to be a people defined by their relationship with God. So 3 days after leading the people out of Egypt, Moses and the Israelites arrive at Mount Sinai, and there they receive some instructions from God, rules to govern them and teach them how to live together in unity and peace, rules that would allow them to uphold their part of the covenant. These rules we call the 10 Commandments. Now, when God gives these laws to Moses, God makes no attempt to sugarcoat them, to turn them into positive statements rather than negative ones, or in any way to make them more palatable. God doesn't ask Moses or the people to work together to figure out mutually acceptable rules like a teacher on the first day of school. And there are certainly no cookies to make them go down a little easier. There's no getting around it. Being God's people means living according to God's rules. This is the Sinai Covenant. God says, "I will be your God. I will hear your cries and liberate you from oppression and love you above all others. And you will be my people and live according to my rules." Preaching professor David Lose likes to say that when it comes to the relationship between law and gospel, 19 comes before 20. What he means by this is that the relationship between God and God's people comes before the law. Only after the relationship is established does God make demands on our behavior. We heard evidence of this in the passage Greer read earlier when God says, "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples." Walter Brueggemann puts it this way: the Exodus emancipation and the Sinai Covenant belong inextricably together. The deliverance is in order to establish the new obedience of Sinai. The new obedience of Sinai is only possible because of the deliverance. In this first family meeting of God's chosen people, God reminds them what God has done for them and lets them know that with freedom comes responsibility. During the Pope's visit to the United States this past week, he spoke at a joint session of Congress, a family meeting of sorts. The Pope did not hold back his criticism of certain policies or his recommendation for how lawmakers ought to move forward on some issues, but ultimately he called for unity by highlighting the lawmakers' responsibilities. Politics, he told them, is an expression of our compelling need to live as one in order to build as one the greatest common good, that of a community which sacrifices particular interests in order to share in justice and peace its goods, its interests, its social life. Now, it's impossible to say whether the Pope had the Ten Commandments in mind when he crafted this portion of his speech, but building the greatest common good by creating a community which sacrifices individual interests for the sake of the whole is exactly what these commandments call us to do. The first few commandments, as Mindy explained earlier, focus on our relationship with God, the rest on our relationships with others. Another way to think about this is that the commandments have both a vertical and a horizontal component. Those directing our relationship with God are oriented vertically, and those directing our relationships with our neighbors are oriented horizontally. In Education Hour today, we will look more closely at the individual commandments, but for now, what these commandments have to teach us as a whole is that our relationship with God is what forms the foundation and the motivation for our relationships with one another. 19 comes before 20. Having freed the Israelites from slavery, God gives the people these commandments which establish what this freedom is for: the creation of a community, a family, who cares for one another according to God's rules. As the Apostle Paul explains it in his letter to the Galatians, "For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself." The family of God is called to serve one another, to care for one another, to rise above differences and conflicts in the service of unity. In the projects of LA, there was a church whose members kept seeing immigrants in their neighborhood, immigrants who were homeless, poor, powerless strangers in a strange land. In response, the church eventually decided to open its doors to these immigrants during the week and give them a place to sleep. Every night, homeless and undocumented workers would sleep in the church. On Sundays, the priest and some of the women of the church would come early and do everything they could to eliminate the smell the men left behind. They'd sprinkle Love My Carpet all over and vacuum like crazy. They'd put scented candles and bowls of potpourri in strategic locations. They'd burn incense. But the smell persisted, and people grumbled. Finally, in worship one day, the priest decided to face the problem head on. During the sermon, he asked the congregation a question: "What's the church smell like?" People were mortified. Women began to search diligently in their purses. Men looked everywhere but at the pulpit. "Come on," the priest said, "what's it smell like in here?" Finally, an old man who never cared what anyone thought anyway shouted, "Smells like feet." "Exactly," the priest replied. "And why does it smell like feet?" "Because homeless men slept here last night," a woman answered. "Why did we let that happen?" asked the priest. "It's what we committed to do," said someone else. "And why would we commit to that?" said the priest. "Because it's what Jesus would do," someone else said. "Well then, what does the church smell like now?" "It smells like commitment," one man called out. "It smells like roses," another woman shouted. When we enter into this covenant with God, it affects who we are as individuals, but even more so, who we are and how we act as a family of faith. According to Brueggemann, the covenant construct permits us and requires us to think afresh about the character and business of the church. The move God has made in heaven opens up for us a new agenda. What is possible on earth? God's move to solidarity hints that solidarity on earth is possible. The church is the community attentive to the dangers and possibilities of solidarity in a culture which thrives on and celebrates our divisions and isolations. Listen to Brueggemann's last sentence again. The church is the community attentive to the dangers and possibilities of solidarity in a culture which thrives on and celebrates our divisions and isolations. The rules given to God's people demand that we devote our energy to living in a unified community. This means the rules are much less about us than they are about our neighbors, about how we treat and interact with other members of God's family. The laws of this covenant are not given to make our lives better. They are here to teach us how to make our neighbors' lives better. These are not rules that guide our self-improvement, but our neighbor improvement, with the benefit that we can all live richer, fuller lives by living together according to these shared rules. This is what it looks like to be God's family. We're family. It's my experience as a pastor in every church I've served that people stay with one church because of the relationships they have there. It's not about the pastors. We come and go. It's not about worship, which may or may not meet your precise needs or desires on any given day. It's about the people, the love and support you find often among people you would never have met anywhere else in your lives. The church is a family. And as a family, we gather together each week at this time for a meeting. And during those meetings, we remember our covenant relationship with God and our call to serve one another. In worship, we meet the God who created us, who calls us, who frees us, and who teaches us how to live together as a family of faith. In worship, we also remember that family is never easy. It cannot be managed simply by agreeing on rules or divvying up chores, and it isn't made easier with affirmations or cookies, although those do sometimes help. Family is the wonderfully challenging, endlessly trying gift of being called out of our selfish, self-centered tendencies to serve one another, to put others before ourselves. Ted Wardlaw tells this story from his days as a pastor in Atlanta. At a presbytery meeting, he writes, "It had been a long day of difficult votes. Finally, when the agenda was over, there was a motion to adjourn, and we were invited to stand for the closing prayer. Our moderator that year was particularly gifted by a rich devotional life, and when he led us in prayer, it was as if he was curling his toes over the edge of heaven itself. As we stood to pray on this occasion, he kept a long silence before he uttered these words, 'Lord, we are forever asking you for many things, and what you are forever giving us instead is the gift of one another.'" We are family, God's family, upheld and guided by God's covenant, given all the love and grace and freedom we need to live together according to God's rules, in unity and in peace. Amen.